Okay, so carrying on in the second half of Act One with Algernon and the distance between the sort of ironic distance between his seemingly kind of frivolous, hysterical overreaction to food and the kind of gravity with which it gets conducted. So one of the things that's important here, Gwendolen and Lady Bracknell have arrived, and he obviously feels that he has to offer them something to eat as part of the kind of polite ritual of greetings. And he says, "Good heavens, Lane, why are there no cucumber sandwiches? I ordered them specially." And I think this exposes a sense of frivolity, that's part of the class satire of the play. But I think it's, again, developed as Lane replies gravely. This conflict between the way that the characters are reacting to this and the actual severity of the idea and the importance of the idea, which again he articulates further down the page. "I'm greatly distressed, Aunt Augusta, about there being no cucumbers, not even for ready money." And I think this sense of the distance in the sort of suitability of the emotional reactions, I think, invites comparison with Blanche and her hysteria that is particularly characterised by her first moments in the play. Her very opening part of her reaction to New Orleans and its diversity and its surroundings, I think, are comparable to this sort of hysterical reaction. But again, also the reliance upon food itself as some form of conduit for repressed feelings in the play, I think, again, would be connected to the motif of kind of drinking in Streetcar. Obviously, in this case, it is a type of evasion from reality as well. It's an evasion from the reality of sexual passion, whereas in Blanche's case, it's an evasion from reality itself in an all-encompassing sense. Further over the page, Algernon says, "It's a great bore. I need hardly say a terrible disappointment to me, but the fact is I've just had a telegram to say that my poor friend Bunbury is very ill again. They seem to think I should be with him." So this deception here, I think, invites us to see Algernon's deception itself as a type of power. It allows him to navigate his way through very prescriptive social norms and to gain a sense of liberty and freedom. And it makes for an interesting contrast with Blanche's deceptions and Stanley's deceptions that appear not to offer them really any chance of power or redemption. So there's a real sense of contrast here, the way in which deception grants the protagonist in each of these plays power. Algernon seems to gain a sense of power from this, and it's part of the comic plot is that the instability of identity and the deception that's at its heart, in the end, resolves itself positively for the protagonist. It produces a social fabric that is cohesive and harmonic, whereas Birthday Party and Streetcar have much more a tragic conclusion, where the social fabric seems to be, for the protagonist in any case, unravelling. And that the social fabric is reasserting itself in a way that leaves the protagonist behind. Then Lady Bracknell says, "Well, I must say, Algernon, that I think it's high time that Mr. Bunbury made up his mind whether he was going to live or die. The shilly-shallying with the question is absurd. Nor do I in any way approve of the modern sympathy with invalids. I consider it morbid. Illness of any kind is hardly a thing to be encouraged in others. Health is the primary duty of life." And I think the language here of orthodoxy, even though it's deliberately ironic and is supposed to expose its callousness, I think reveals that sort of connection with Stanley Kowalski. First of all, the section of the extent to which a kind of brutalistic, harsh reality is at the heart of an orthodox vision of social relations. He sees it as a crude kind of materialism devoid of any sense of moralism or aesthetic. Lady Bracknell here, I think, has a similarly kind of cut and dry vision of the way that social behaviour should be conducted, particularly in regarding those who are weak. And I think we see that connection with Stanley Kowalski, that lack of sympathy for those who are in weaker positions than him, or lack his resolution and will to be powerful. Further down as well, where she says, illness of any kind is hardly a thing to be encouraged with others. I think this again invites this sort of comparison with Goldberg's bizarre request to get McCann to blow in his mouth after that sense of crisis that he experiences due to his own lack of purpose, his own lack of internal conviction, and the way that he tricks himself into sort of believing that he's acting in a purposeful way purely on the grounds of his sort of positive health. That's his assertion of purpose and rationale. Over the playage, Gwendolyn's with Jack on his own. Brady Backman now going to go into the music room, and they exchange this dialogue. The charming day it's been, Miss Fairfax. Pray don't talk to me about the weather, Mr. Worthing. Whenever people talk to me about the weather, I always feel quite certain they mean something else, and that makes me so nervous. I do mean something else. I thought so, in fact, and I'm never wrong. Now, this is a consistent overlap, I think, between this play and all of the others, is that communication at cross purposes. The difference here between language and the ultimate subtext of what's going on in the dialogue, or the language that's being articulated in the characters. Here it's based on a kind of felicitous flirtation between the two characters, but in a birthday party, that falsity of language is probably one of the central sort of dangers to the protagonist in the play. And then also Blanche uses this quite evasive language in order to encourage her own deception. So there's a real sense of this play doing the sorts of things that an aesthete like Blanche carries out, but showing that her values and her conviction in those beliefs is falling foul to the changing tides of history, that she's coming out on the wrong side of that particular conflict. Jack has a moment of inarticulacy as well. Miss Fairfax, ever since I met you, I've admired you more than any girl I've ever met since I met you. And the circularity of his speech here, the fact that he actually carried out what's called a tautology, a needless repetition, shows us, I think, actually a moment of authenticity. And there's an interesting, consistent theme in this play about the authenticity of feeling being almost beyond language in many of the plays. That we certainly see that in Pinter, that language itself is an unreliable vehicle for communicating the real feelings of the characters in the plays, and it's something that we see here. Gwendolyn at the bottom says, we live, as I hope you know, Mr. Worthing, in an age of ideals. The fact is constantly mentioned in the more expensive monthly magazines and has reached the provincial pulpits, I'm told. And my ideal has always been to love someone of the name of Ernest. There is something in that name that inspires absolute confidence. The moment Algernon first mentioned to me that he had a friend called Ernest, I knew I was destined to love you. So there's a number of things going on here that I think invite comparison. With Blanche, the fact that both of these female characters are viewing both their fate and reality itself through the lens of an idealized construct. They are constructing an idealized vision of how they desire reality to be, and then pursuing it based on the ends of that idealized vision. That in this case is entirely trivial, much more so deliberately for satirical effect. But in Blanche's case, that's not necessarily the case. That her idealized vision is one that she tragically clings to and finds herself destroyed because of that adherence to that idealized vision. Here, the adherence to this particularly trivial idealized vision is rewarded as part of the aesthetic of comedy. Now, Jack says, your name isn't Ernest. Your name is Ernest. Yes, I know it is, but supposing it was something else, do you mean to say you couldn't love me then? That's clearly a metaphysical speculation, and like most metaphysical speculations, there's very little reference at all to the actual facts of real life as we know them. Now, the enormous element of irony here exposes her falsity. as the speculation itself is real. You know, the thing that she criticizes as an inaccurate metaphysical speculation, lacking reality, is actually real at this moment in time, but in the end turns out to be unreal. So we end up having this kind of proliferating chain of deception, where the character's own deceptions are shrouded reality that in the end appears to be false. And so there is this, again, I think an important questioning of whether we can actually know anything truthful in this play that I think invites a connection to Pinter's. You know, is it possible actually to know anyone? Is it actually possible to gain knowledge of people and individuals? Well, here is because of the sheer kind of proliferating surface of verbal play and deliberate performative deception, whereas in Pinter it's actually because of the failure of language and our active attempts to shroud our identities. At the bottom, Jack says, Gwendolen, I must get christened at once. I mean, we must get married at once. There's no time to be lost. So again, their attraction is based on this kind of literal inauthenticity. And I think it offers an interesting contrast to the sort of Blanche-Mitch attraction, that their attraction is based on a moment of rare authenticity to a certain extent. You know, Blanche, their status as victims and outsiders is what's authentic about their connection, but Blanche's Blanche's insistence on her own false performative identity is in the end what partly unravels that potential connection, as well as Stanley's kind of active, menacing destruction of that. Gwendolen then says, I think it would be an admirable opportunity to spare you any possible disappointment, Mr. Worthing. I think it only fair to tell you quite frankly beforehand that I'm fully determined to accept you. Yes, Mr. Worthing, what have you got to say to me? You know what I've got to say to you, yes, but you don't say it. And so here, we see, I think, an interesting ritual. We've got a ritual of matrimony, you know, the ritual of proposal. One of those moments in life where language is supposed to be at its most powerful and its most inauthentic. You know, that's the type of, that moment in life where people spend huge amounts of time thinking about what they're going to say. And here, their certainty and their fixation upon marrying each other, their motivation, is so determined that it renders language actually pointless and meaningless, that there's no real reason for Jack to actually say what he's going to say because she knows it already. And so there is, I think, a sense of the untrustworthy nature of language, particularly at these moments of repetitive ritual, that we see it again, particularly in Goldberg's kind of extended speeches in the play, where he sort of riffs on the nature of childhood, where he describes nostalgic recollections in a way that are ultimately designed to give himself a sort of cohesive sense of self, but that is entirely performative. Now, at the bottom, Gwendolen says, I know my brother Gerald does, all my girlfriends tell me so. What wonderfully blue eyes you have, Ernest. They are quite blue. I hope you will always look at me just like that, especially when there are other people present. So there's this vision, you know, this desire. We see vision itself often as the basis for an authentic connection between individuals. But here it's based entirely on this sort of socially produced identity that she wants to be seen, being seen, rather than to be seen itself. She wants there to be this proliferating surface to her identity and its consumption visually by others. And so there's an interesting connection here, I think, with Blanche. You know, that her insistence on the way that she is seen and seen by others is an important aspect of her performance. And we see a connection here with Gwendolen. I think contrast with Stanley Weber, who seems steadfastly opposed to the idea of performative identity when it comes to social production. But again, you know, he is not blameless in that regard. You know, his nostalgic performance of his artistic identity, his piano playing in those stories, I think, again, shows that we all fall foul to this element of inauthenticity and inconsistency. Lady Bracknell is not happy about this particularly. She says, pardon me, you are not engaged to anyone. When you do become engaged to someone, I or your father should his health permit him, will inform you of the fact An engagement should come on a young girl as a surprise, pleasant or unpleasant as the case may be. It's hardly a matter that she could be allowed to arrange for herself. And so, again, his ritual of matrimony, which is obviously an integral feature of the comic aesthetic, becomes associated, I think, with power. And so we think of the birthday party as a moment of affirmation for the self. We think of marriage almost as a moment of affirmation for the self, grounded in rituals. And yet, in both cases, they're about almost the divestment of power from the individual. Gwendolen is divested of the free will to choose her own marriage here, even though her own motivations for doing so are based on a kind of shambolic farce. While Stanley is actually robbed of his identity during this ritual that is supposed to be about the affirmation of identity and selfhood. At the bottom of the page, I feel bound to tell you that you are not down on my list of eligible young men. And he talks about the Duchess. I have the same list as the dear Duchess of Bolton. However, I'm quite ready to enter your name should your answers be what a really affectionate mother requires. Do you smoke? The fact that this question is the first one that she asks shows us this kind of ridiculous nature of these interrogations. And Jack says, well, yes, I admit I smoke. And she says, I'm glad to hear it. A man should always have an occupation of some kind. There are far too many idle men in London as it is. And I think this empty sense of social norms and orthodoxy in late Victorian England, I think, invites comparison to Blanche's kind of class superiority, but also, I think, to Goldberg and McCann's treatment of Stanley, where they provide a series of almost an impossible range of social norms for him to try and adhere to, that in the end rob him of his selfhood. And there's Lady Bracknell's criteria for Jack, I think, offer that moment, that sort of baffling impossibility. She asks, I've always been of opinion that a man who desires to get married should know either everything or nothing. Which do you know? I know nothing, Lady Bracknell. I'm pleased to hear it. I do not approve of anything that tampers with natural ignorance. Ignorance is like a delicate exotic fruit. Touch it and the bloom is gone. And I think this, the nonsensical nature of this paradoxical epigram about the value of ignorance that produces a very satirical picture of what is valued in upper class circles, I think mirrors the emptiness of what is valued in Goldberg and McCann's vision of orthodoxy. That it isn't so much as about any integral, authentic belief in orthodoxy, it's simply the performance of belonging to social institutions who have power. And so the nonsensical qualities of what they end up drawing out of Stanley as the basis for his treatment are part of that overall revelation of its empty value. That you as long as you get someone to pay lip service to their commitment, that repetition of that is enough to gain their adherence to social norms. She asks about her income, and he says it's between 7,000 and 8,000 a year, which is obviously quite a lot more at this particular moment in time. But then she wants to know in land or investments, and I think that this is a moment where the sort of naked reality of material power is exposed in the play. This is really what she's interested in, and the crude display of that in between these little gaps of the sort of proliferating wittiness of the dialogue shows us that this is really at the bottom of what's going on here. Jack explains that he has a country house with some land, of course, but he doesn't depend on it on real income. And then Lady Bracknell responds, a country house, how many bedrooms? Well, that point can be cleared up afterwards. You have a townhouse, I hope. A girl with a simple, unspoiled nature like Gwendolen could hardly be expected to reside in the country. And so there's a deliberate reversal of expectations here. There's a reversal of the conventions of restoration comedy that this play builds from, of the town and the city being these binary locations in relation to sin and corruption and purity and innocence. She reverses these very deliberately on purpose, but I think again it invites a comparison with Blanche's lost sense of innocence in the sort of the pastoral idyll of the southern plantation of Belle Reve. That location in both plays no longer contains that connotation of innocence and idealised morality. He asked about the house. What number in Belgrave Square? 149. The unfashionable side. I thought there was something, however, that could easily be altered. Do you mean the fashion or the side? Certainly, both if necessary, I presume. So there's this, I think, a sense of the whimsicality of the social codes that govern Lady Bracknell's preferences that I think is deliberately made absurd in Goldberg and McCann's interactions with Stanley, and also is partly sort of revealed in the opening section of Streetcar with Blanche's preferences and the whimsicality of her sense of social orthodoxy. So the whimsicality or absurdity of social codes is something that both plays, or all three plays, attempt to expose in various ways. And she asks about his politics. And again, those are part of the sham as well. I'm a liberal unionist, and they're talking about, at this moment in time, the issue of home rule for Ireland. And Lady Bracknell, as they believe in the same thing, says, oh, they count as Tories, they dine with us, or come in the evening at any rate. Now to minor matters. You know, there's, again, the sense of material power that's based on class that I think connects to the Stanley Blanche dynamic here, but it's interesting that we have a sort of reversal, in that the female character is the one that holds all of the material power, and actually the sense of class superiority, which is completely complicated in Stanley and Blanche's interactions, because it is about the way in which actually the class positions are transforming and reversing, and Blanche is going to come out on the wrong side of that transformation. Jack says, I've lost both of my parents, and Lady Bracknell says, to lose one parent, Mr. Worthing, may be regarded as a misfortune. To lose both looks like carelessness. Obviously playing on the meaning of the word language, but that cold lack of pity or concern, I think, shows us a real exposure of the whimsicality of those in power and their heartlessness that I think we see in Goldberg and McCann as well, that heartless lack of human empathy. You know, she asked about his father. Who was he? Was he born in what the radical papers call the purple of commerce, or did he rise from the ranks of the aristocracy? So she's only really interested in his class origins, and gives him two choices, that either he's new money made from capitalism, or he's already aristocratic. There's no alternative to this. And Jack says, I don't really know. The fact is, Lady Bracknell, I said I'd lost my parents. It would be nearer the truth to say my parents seem to have lost me. I don't actually know who I am by birth. I was found. So this sense of disorientation of identity, this lack of legitimacy that he possesses in her eyes, because he is not anchored to a particular aristocratic family and a pattern of lineage. Contrast with Blanche, who has this very strong sense of lineage and class position, but that class position in many ways is anchored to a failing ideology and a set of social values that are being outmoded. Here, he, however, is sort of in the end freed up by his lack of connection. In the end, his sort of fabrication ends up being unnecessary, because he, from the word go, is attached to power. You know, his birth is a lot more powerful than he thinks it is at this particular moment in time. And so the ideal ends up being played out by reality, which is obviously a complete contrast with Blanche, whose ideal ends up being destroyed by reality. He describes what happened. The late Mr. Thomas Cardew, a gentleman of a very charitable and kindly disposition, found me and gave me the name of Worthing, because he happened to have a first-class ticket for Worthing in his pocket at the time. Worthing is a place in Sussex. It's a seaside resort. So his name is taken from a geographical embodiment of class destiny. You know, the train ticket that he, the train line which he's found is the train line that moves through the kind of fashionable parts of London and out onto the wealthy parts of the south coast. And so his location and his name itself is an embodiment of that class destiny, which is directly the opposite of Blanche's. You know, she is on the failing side of destiny and history in terms of her class position, whereas Jack is on the complete reverse. He finds himself actually being reintegrated into the position of power that he possesses, or that he is performing. Describes where he was found, that he was found in a handbag, a somewhat large black leather handbag with handles to it, an ordinary handbag, in fact. And so this symbol, I think, becomes the connotation of his sort of masked identity. You know, it reveals the way that he actually has a sense of self that is not really what's being performed. You know, it's a different version of himself. It is a more humble origin. But of course, the central irony of this play is that the humble origin that he thinks he has ends up actually not being true, and that he is, you know, attached to material power and wealth in a way that he doesn't really realise. And so the fantasy that he performs ends up becoming true, and that art, as is the case in Wilde's aesthetic, ends up creating life. You know, life ends up mirroring art rather than the other way around, whereas Blanche finds herself on an opposite trajectory. But that masked identity, I think, invites comparison to the paper lantern that we see Blanche constantly invoking in Streetcar and manoeuvring herself in relation to. So, Lady Bracknell says, he was found in the cloakroom at Victoria Station. Yes, the Brighton line. And she says, the line is immaterial, Mr. Worthy. I confess I feel somewhat bewildered by what you've just told me. To be born, or at any rate bred, in a handbag, whether it had handles or not, seems to me to display a contempt for the ordinary decencies of family life. And it reminds me of one of the worst excesses of the French Revolution. So there's this hysterical sense of class paranoia that is at the basis of her hostile reaction here. The ordinary decencies of family life, you know, is what she's really talking about, is the way that rich people are brought up. You know, that if you are brought up in this way and end up succeeding, it creates a sense of social mobility that threatens the position of those in aristocratic positions. And so that threat to orthodoxy that Jack poses as an individual, I think, is comparable to the threat to orthodoxy that Goldberg and McCann locate in Stanley. That he, in some ways, is an existential threat to their commitment to an inauthentic sense of power based on a performance of social orthodoxy. Importantly, she also says the line is immaterial, and it's completely not immaterial. And so Lady Bracknell can't see Jack's sort of potential power, and that lack of vision in these individuals, I think, again, invites comparison with many of the other characters. You know, the limited vision of Stanley Kowalski, not necessarily, you know, it's a reverse of what's limited in his vision. All Stanley can see is power. He can't see anything else. Goldberg and McCann the same. They can't see the purposeless nature of their existence, but they can see power. Here, Lady Bracknell actually fails to anticipate power. And she says, as for the particular locality in which the handbag was found, a cloakroom at a railway station might serve to conceal a social indiscretion, but it could hardly be regarded as an assured basis for a recognised position in good society. And so that sense of the uncertainty of his beginnings, undermining his potential incorporation into the social fabric of the powerful and the wealthy, is important.